All right, looks like we have some participants joining us. We'll get started here in just a few minutes. All right, we'll give people one more minute and then we'll get started. All right, it is 2 o'clock. Let's get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the first of Cohesion's 4-part webinar series. My name is Elizabeth Merchant and I'm the Senior Marketing Manager here at Cohesion. Today's webinar is Why Air Quality Matters at the Office. Before we get into it, I am going to mention a few housekeeping items. We will be addressing questions from the audience in the last 10 minutes of our presentation today. So feel free to submit questions at any time during today's presentation into the chat box. This content will also be available later for on-demand viewing, and we encourage you to share it with anyone who you would think would like to know more about indoor air quality. Last but not least, at the end of the event, there is a short survey. It's only a few questions and would be really helpful to our team to hear your feedback on today's event. All right, let's get started. All right, today's agenda, we're going to start with an introduction to indoor air quality from our panelists here. Our panelists are then going to go into a discussion on indoor air quality, and we'll reserve about the last 10 minutes of today's presentation for an audience Q&A. I'm excited to introduce to you our speakers today, Ren and Tara. Ren is the Vice President of Product at Cohesion. He's responsible for defining the product vision and strategy for Cohesion's technology platforms and leads a team that's crafted the best in industry experiences to deliver ultimate value to clients. Tara is the data scientist at Cohesion. She extracts insights from building operations and tenant data sets that inform decision-making for our customers and help us to build innovative building automation products. She's been working closely with our product and engineering teams to improve our indoor air quality optimization program with data. All right, over to you, Ren and Tara.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you to everybody in the audience for joining us today. We are very excited to talk with you about indoor air quality, which is a very important topic to us here at Cohesion. And I actually want to start off by taking a little trip down memory lane. There was a time when I would wake up in the morning, get in my car, drive into the city, park and walk into a 30-story building, and then spend the whole day there and never once thinking about the air that I was breathing or the ventilation system or what was around me. I'm sure all of you still remember what that was like. Unfortunately, that time has passed us and it will likely take a very long time before our behavior and thinking fully returns to that idyllic state, if ever. COVID-19 has had devastating effects on the world, and it has made us think much more about our health and safety in all contexts, but most of all indoors and in proximity of others, where we spend the majority of our lives. As horrific as a pandemic has been, one of the silver linings has been its effect as an accelerant for change. I'm sure you've all seen a dramatic increase in interest, technology, and thought leadership around IAQ in the past few months. But the fact of the matter is, air quality in buildings has always been an important topic, just like health has always been an important topic. It's just only now it's in the spotlight and people care more than ever about what they are breathing in. The fact that air and pathogens are invisible to humans and that we spend so much of our lives in buildings makes this such an interesting and important focus for building occupants, building management, and building owners now more than ever before. The pandemic has been an absolute roller coaster. We've experienced hype, fear, even panic. We've experienced spikes in cases, valleys in cases, closings, reopenings, mandate changes every other week, vaccinations and variants. Through these unknowns, I believe some things are here to stay, and I believe a focus on air quality is one of those things. Someday, we may even see air quality being regulated similarly to food and water. More on those ideas in a bit, but first, my colleague Tara will give us a good definition of what indoor air quality means. Tara, over to you.
All right, thanks, Bren. So what do we mean by indoor air quality, or IAQ? Well, IAQ can be simply defined as the quality of air within a building, but as it relates to the health and comfort of occupants. So there's two distinct factors that can affect the quality of air indoors, and therefore the health and comfort of the people inside of it. There's pathogens. So that includes things like viruses and bacteria, mainly from human sources. As Ren just painted a picture of, we've learned a lot about how pathogens can spread throughout the air from experiencing this pandemic. But air quality can also be affected by environmental factors. So this is temperature, it's humidity, and it's also pollutant concentration levels. And I'll talk more about particular pollutants in just a minute. But an important point here overall is that now we can measure and we can monitor these environmental dynamics within a building pretty accurately. And so that is allowing us to learn from them and then to control them with good building design and smart ventilation systems. And so these two sides to IAQ they're related to one another, meaning that if we can better control our environment indoors, so that's temperature, humidity, and pollutant concentrations, those things that we can measure, we can also decrease the chances that pathogens survive in the air and spread and are infecting the humans that are inside of the building. So getting into a little bit more detail here on the pollutants and the data. We have listed here a handful of metrics, and these are what we typically measure in order to get a good picture of the environmental quality inside of an indoor space. So we measure the concentration of TVOCs, or the total volatile organic compounds. So VOCs are particular chemicals that are often found in the air indoors. They come from things like paints and cleaners, other common building materials. And so, depending on the choices of materials and chemicals that a building uses, those can be pretty prevalent within an office space. We also measure the concentrations of particulate matter, or PM. So you can think of PM as the tiny dust particles that could be measured at different widths. So typically 10 or 2.5 microns. And so inside, this comes from sources like cooking, pollen, or mold. And so this dust can be extremely irritating to the respiratory system. It's a big trigger for allergies, for asthma symptoms. So it's really important that those concentrations are kept as low as possible inside. We also, of course, have CO2, or carbon dioxide. CO2 indoors is mostly associated with human activity. So people walking around, breathing, talking to each other. The more people that there are within a concentrated space and without adequate ventilation, the more CO2 that we're going to see. We also measure, of course, temperature and humidity. So these are obviously very important factors for occupant comfort, but also for health. So high humidity levels inside can contribute to the growth of mold. They generally allow pollutant concentrations to build up in the air. And there's also, if there's lots of swings in temperature and humidity, that can negatively affect a person's immune system. So there are serious health risks associated with these pollutants, especially when people have had long-term exposure to them. As Ren said, considering how much time we spend indoors, we can start to see how important it is that we are monitoring and we're optimizing indoor air quality. So for example, we just talked about particulate matter. It's estimated that something like 88,000 annual lung cancer deaths worldwide can be attributed directly to exposure to PM. And then high concentrations of CO2 or VOCs, these often can cause people to get headaches, fatigue, dizziness. And so, if the air quality is unoptimal, the office can quickly become an unpleasant place to be or an unsafe place to be. All right, so let's talk about what happens when we do optimize air quality within an office space. We have some evidence that there can be some significant measurable benefits for office workers if good air quality is maintained. And so this is showing a Harvard School of Public Health study. They found there was a 35% decrease in short-term sick leave when office buildings improve their ventilation and therefore the indoor environmental quality. So optimizing those metrics that I just described. There's another study that was more focused on the economic impacts of IAQ, and they estimated that companies could gain about $6,500 per employee just in increased productivity if they improved their ventilation rates. And then lastly, there are multiple ways that we can actually optimize indoor air quality. But if you choose to do so by improving ventilation intelligently, so meaning using that sensor technology, taking into consideration how occupants are actually using your spaces, there's opportunity to increase energy efficiency of your building operations as well here. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But just to wrap up here, we all love to talk about ROI. I love to talk about numbers, but it's important to remember that IAQ matters because we're talking about clean air and we're talking about human health. And so building owners and operators and employers who lease spaces and buildings, they all have an obligation to really ensure that we are providing the safest and healthiest places to work. And so that means becoming educated on these dynamics that happen within a building, the risks and the benefits associated with indoor air quality, and then going ahead and deploying effective solutions to minimize pollutant exposure for occupants.
All right, thanks, Tara. That was an excellent summary of the effects of good indoor air quality. I think once people learn about the effects of air quality, it's much easier to start paying attention and to want to start breathing in healthier air. However, that's not always easy to accomplish, and oftentimes that choice is not in their hands. Oftentimes that choice is in the hands of a few key decision makers, people who manage or own the buildings that we all occupy. So it's really important to understand the dynamics between them. Can we go to the next slide? Perfect. All right. So for occupiers, we are now at the peak of knowledge and expectations around health in buildings. And I would argue that the current landscape we're seeing rivals any situation we've seen before in terms of severity and scale. And every passing day sees awareness increase and the topic of IAQ grow. In a way, the journey we're on is very similar to the journey in the mid-1900s related to the dangers of asbestos. People didn't really understand how asbestos was affecting them until there was much more research and a public spotlight being shined upon it. And until then, it was just an average everyday building material. From a building owner and operator perspective, there is so much investment being poured into building HVAC systems with the latest filters and modernizations and building automation systems. The pandemic has also given rise to new hardware like bipolar ionization, UV cleaning technology. And however, we know that nothing is more effective than bringing in more clean outside air. And doing so on demand with the power of data is an area that is finally accessible and extremely cost effective. So we'll show you more on that in a moment. Regardless of the method though, building owners and operators that take the time to learn and invest in their systems will have an advantage over their competitors when it comes to tenant attraction and retention. And we all know that employees have higher expectations now than ever of their employers and of their workplaces. And as employers usher employees back to the office over the coming months, they need to give them a reason to come in and at the very least reduce the risk or fear of doing so. Employees will vote by choosing which employers they vote for, and employers will vote by choosing where they want the office. And all of that puts significant pressure and opportunity at the feet of building owners and operators to deliver a healthier and more transparent experience around air quality. So one thing we say a lot at Cohesion is if you can't measure it, you can't change it. And our approach at Cohesion really starts with data. Even though we're focused on the topic of indoor air quality today, our entire smart building platform has been built with data collection and aggregation as a primary focus. So let's take a look at how we apply that to IAQ. All right, so what you see here is our process for optimizing a building's air. On the left-hand side, we start by installing sensors in the building that can intelligently and in real time monitor actual pollutant levels in spaces. And then when pollutant levels actually spike, we notify the building operators so they know what's going on and which spaces are having issues. And all of these things are obviously collected and analyzed later as well. We then kick off our IAQ optimization service, which is another way of saying we have an intelligent control mechanism that determines the best course of action given what pollutants are spiking, what time of day it is, what room it is, and historical data and things like that. And we'll show you that in a moment. And then when we're able to partner with the building, we can actually intelligently command the HVAC system to increase airflow to a space and make sure that the air is suited to the conditions in the space. And when all of that can happen in real time, air is constantly being optimized, and we're collecting all the data of these optimizations and using that to inform our algorithms and making them smarter over time. So the system is actually getting better and better at doing this as time goes on and as we deploy this to more of our customers. We can go to the next slide. So this is a deeper dive at kind of how this works in the background. So again, like I mentioned, everything is built upon data, and the more data that you have, the more things you can optimize for, and you can do so much more efficiently. And sometimes that's from a real-time response standpoint, whether it's from the sensor that we install or something existing in the system. But sometimes that's also from historical data and other things that we collect. So, sometimes you need to know exactly what's happening in the moment, and other times you have other things that help you, like weather predictions, historical data, and things like that. But all of that rich context on the left that you see here feeds our robust control model that learns over time and is actively controlling the devices in the building. And again, this is a deeper look at how we do what we do, but the most important thing is that this results in a very dynamic way of operating building systems. And that not only keeps the air clean, but it also reduces the energy usage over a more traditional kind of one-size-fits-all approach. And we can go to the next slide. So I want to be clear that the solution that we're showing you here, it fits into an overall air quality strategy, and that encompasses lots of other systems and behaviors in the building. And the best way to achieve the most optimal outcome is to let these methods work together to create that synergy. So everything that we've built here really harmoniously kind of fits into all of the existing systems and processes inside a building and makes them stronger. All right, so we would like to shift to a slightly more conversational style for the rest of the webinar. And to kick us off, I have a question for Tara. So Tara, what opportunities do you see for the application of data to the air quality problem in buildings?
Yeah, great question. So I think that smart buildings and data really go hand in hand. And in general, this is a really exciting industry to be in, right now as a data scientist. Machine learning and big data have been kind of finding their way into nearly every industry, but some have been slower to adopt than others. And one of those is commercial real estate. And so the field is pretty wide open, and I think there's tons of opportunity here. As far as how data comes into play with IAQ, I think we just start with the basics, which is monitoring. There's a ton of information. I think that the average building owner, operator, and tenant can get just by visualizing the pollutant levels over time and in different building spaces. Just recently, IAQ sensor companies are coming out with these higher quality, more affordable indoor air quality sensors. And these can be installed in numerous places within the building, connected to the cloud, streamed directly to some Viz software in near real time. And so we're very used to monitoring and regulating things like temperature and humidity, but I think it should become commonplace that we're doing the same thing with pollutant concentrations. And then we should also be collecting and monitoring operational data from ventilation systems. These systems are often already hooked up to some building automation network that can be connected to in a similar way. And so it's just a matter of bringing that down at the right frequency and then integrating it properly with those IAQ sensor systems. And then with both of these data sets in hand, the next obvious opportunity is to implement some anomaly detection program. So something that automatically triggers an alert when things don't look normal. So that's either when pollutant levels are too high, or their pattern is changing in some interesting way, or maybe when some piece of HVAC equipment is not responding to controls properly. And so this area is where machine learning really helps us, because as humans, as even expert building engineers, we can't always spot this before it's too late. And that's not only because there can be thousands of pieces of equipment in a building, but we just don't always know what we're looking for. And so the machine learning algorithm can do the work of characterizing what is normal and then alert us when something is outside of that normal range, automatically. And then the last thing I'll mention is taking this one step further. Machine learning control is a new area of research that can advance HVAC control systems. So now that we have all this high quality pollutant level data and HVAC data, we can use that to train models that will intelligently control ventilation in indoor spaces. And it can do so in an efficient manner. So, these more advanced control systems, they have the potential to deliver those energy savings to buildings as well. So tons of opportunity for data and data technologies and machine learning to really make a difference in this space. But again, it all starts with monitoring, with collecting that high quality granular data and making it accessible to the people that can learn from it and make decisions. But that brings up an interesting question that I have for you about data transparency. And so you've been doing all this user research and talking to a lot of clients. So what do you think about how much transparency tenants and building owners really want when it comes to indoor air quality?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's very fascinating kind of learning about this firsthand by talking to users and talking to our customers. And, in reality, everybody has a slightly different perspective on this, but I can tell you what the data says first. So we've conducted an ongoing survey over the past year that now has over 1,500 respondents, and we found that 85 to 90% of office workers would want to know what their air quality is at the office. And I think that's not surprising given kind of the recent climate, and again, kind of what we've noticed earlier with just an increased focus and awareness of how pathogens are transmitted through the air. I think, I would be surprised if it wasn't that high, but clearly, occupants are very, very interested in that transparency. But transparency is not a one-way street, and in no way does it only provide value for the occupant. It also allows operators and owners in the buildings to take credit for their systems and improvements. So I mentioned earlier that there's lots of kind of improvements happening, or lots of upgrades, lots of investments being made in these systems. And today, while IAQ is still growing, it's a great way to allow the building to really take credit for all of those upgrades that they're making. And it's a great way to allow them to become a leader and differentiate their property from their competition. And really, I think someday it will also be very, very commonplace. It'll probably be commoditized at some point. It'll probably just be expected that a building will be monitoring indoor air quality, and that it will be sharing that with its tenants in the same way that lots of other things are regulated today. So I think, to prepare for that and to really become a leader, a lot of people are starting to think about becoming more transparent with their tenants about the indoor air quality in their buildings. And also from talking to our clients, we know that buildings would rather get ahead of the problem and own the narrative around IAQ rather than have tenants procure their own solutions and have the building be potentially unaware of issues in a tenant space. And I think what it comes down to is the problem doesn't just go away, right? If you don't think about it, that data is out there. That data is literally in the air, and you just need the right technology to see it. So it's all about who can get to that data first and influence it, and then share it accordingly. So great question again, Tara. I got another one for you. So continuing down kind of this path of the importance of data that we've been talking about, what are some interesting trends and learnings that we've gained from looking at our rich IAQ data set?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about monitoring pollutant levels over time and in different building spaces. So what happens when we look at that data a little bit more closely, using statistics, analyzing it, we can start to extract some interesting patterns over time, and we can also see the interaction among different building spaces. So as far as time varying trends, some of the things we've been able to see, we've been able to extract patterns such as the buildup of CO2 that's happening in office spaces that are occupied throughout the day. We've seen spikes in TVOC concentrations during nightly maintenance, so things that are scheduled. We can see that in our data. And we've also seen level shifts occurring. So like complete elevations in baseline pollutant concentrations occur with the changing of the seasons, with like increased humidity. And so all of these patterns are real examples that are that we can see in our data and that are important for building operators to see as well, because it starts to become really apparent that the occupancy dynamics and the maintenance schedules and like the choices of cleaners and things like that they use in the building, those are affecting air quality in real time. So once they see that, they can choose to adjust from there. I also mentioned space varying trends. So, the context of the building spaces is really important to be able to pair with the IAQ data. At Cohesion, we do the work of mapping the sensors and important HVAC equipment to spaces in the building. And so with that, that relational data, we can run some graph analyses and some correlations to identify which spaces are the potential sources of pollutants for other spaces. So for example, one of our clients saw that the kitchen area was often the first space on the floor to experience elevated TVOCs. And then shortly afterward, like the neighboring offices would experience that same elevation in TVOC concentration. And so this type of analysis gets into like diagnostics. It can be used to investigate why a particular space might be experiencing unhealthy air quality by being able to track down where the pollutants might be originating from. So those are some examples of the things we've already seen in our data. We're just scratching the surface. So these are really rich data sets that are describing the dynamics within a building. And so it's closely related to the topic of digital twin, which we'll talk about later in another webinar. Last question to you, Ren. We've been talking a lot about the benefits of having data insights related to IAQ, both from a personal health standpoint and a company standpoint and for building operations. What are some of the other benefits that you're finding customers are looking for when they're deciding on an IAQ solution?
Yeah, great question, Tara. I think it's fascinating because people are discovering more and more benefits as we learn more about kind of how these systems get deployed and kind of the interactions between what's going on between all the various stakeholders in the building as well. So I think, we don't know all the benefits today, but I'll highlight on some of the key things that we found so far. So I mentioned earlier that a focus on IAQ and a smarter ventilation strategy is something that's here to stay. And one of the things that gives it staying power is that an IAQ focused ventilation strategy that's smart can actually be far more energy efficient and make the building far more energy efficient. So I think one of the major values that will continue on for a very, very long time will be on the sustainability front. So in the future, I think we're going to see, in the near future, more and more contention between the forces that are, trying to be more energy efficient in the building with the forces that are trying to be, more healthy in the building. And I do think that a data-driven approach is the only way to have both, because I think traditionally when people have said, okay, there's a huge focus on health right now in the middle of the pandemic, for example, let's open all of our outside air dampers to 100%. Let's just, make sure we're getting the freshest air in the building at all times. That is not very energy efficient, but it's very good at making the building healthy on a aggregate level. And then in the same vein, when buildings want to save energy, it's all about, hey, let's shut down and try to, overall use less energy, but it doesn't take into account certain certain spaces or certain conditions that might actually require a little bit more ventilation on a time by time basis. So I do think that the data-driven approach that we outlined earlier is the only way to have the best of both worlds, and I don't think either of those worlds will be going away. So kind of naturally, something's got to give, and we got to figure out how to make the operations of the building much more dynamic and data-driven. And I think what adds even more importance to this is that many companies will have hybrid working models going forward, which makes demand and occupancy very difficult to assume or predict. So real-time monitoring will help operators run their systems on a as-needed basis, right? And really adapt to the changing conditions in real time. And I want to just kind of end with one example here. So during the pandemic, when buildings were nearly completely empty, I think a lot of the statistics out there say that usage was down by as much as 80+% at one point, but also some of those same studies say that energy usage only decreased by about 30%. So 80% decrease in occupancy, but 30% decrease in energy, something doesn't quite add up there. So really, this is a sign of a severe need for more data and smarter buildings in general. But going back to your question about overall benefits, I think we've covered lots of different benefits in lots of different areas. So to kind of summarize, right, we've talked about how there are lots of benefits for individuals just in terms of personal health. lots of benefits for companies, whether it's in productivity or efficiency or talent attraction and retention. And then for buildings, there is a clear benefit to synergize all the different systems and all the different investments that are going into these systems, and then give them more to talk about on the ESG front. So when it comes to investments and things like that, this is becoming a hotter topic as well. And then I think lastly, we don't talk about this enough, but if ultimately we're able to achieve a much more dynamic way of operating buildings and achieve a much more sustainable way to operate buildings, then that is a huge benefit for the entire world and for our planet. So, that is definitely something that we're driven by, and we try to keep all of those benefits and all those values in mind when we build our products here at Cohesion.
Thanks, Ren and Tara. We do have a couple of audience questions that have come in, so I'm going to read those to you guys now. To our participants who are here, if you have any additional questions, feel free to put those in the chat as Ren and Tara answer these questions. So first audience question here is, which sensors do you use for IAQ measurements? Tara mentioned high accuracy and affordable sensors. Can you give some examples of sensors that you have used in your deployments?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And there are lots of companies out there that are making kind of commercial grade sensors that are also kind of mass produced and accessible. I think, sensor technology has definitely come a long way, but now it's really become, something that lots of companies are doing well. So there's lots of companies out there that we've worked with in the past. I'll just name a few of them. So we've worked with Kytera, we've worked with Aware, we've worked with AirThings. These are all companies that are doing great things with sensor technologies. And I think, it really depends on the needs of the client and what they're going for. But for the most part, out of all of those pollutants that Tara mentioned earlier, these are all typical things that these air quality sensors have in common in terms of what they measure and how they do it. So those are just some examples, and I might be missing some off the top of my head here, but there are lots of different options that our clients are looking at as well. So I would say that when we build Cohesion as a smart building platform, our goal is to be agnostic to the hardware that is needed, so that we can work with a variety of different hardware types and manufacturers. If the building already has certain sensors installed, we can go ahead and leverage those and just go ahead and integrate with those as well. So we're trying to be very flexible here and not say that anything that we've outlined really depends on any particular hardware, but there are lots of great companies out there doing awesome things, and sensor tech is absolutely improving.
Thanks, Ren. I have another question here. Are you seeing greater adoption of IAQ monitoring in some type of buildings, commercial, residential, et cetera, versus others?
Sorry, lost my unmute button there. Yeah, so I think right now we are very much focused on the commercial sector, but I think IAQ, again, is such an important topic because we spend so much of our time indoors, and it's, no matter which setting we're in, it's very, very important to consider that, right? So it's not enough to only focus on it at the office or only focus it in the home. Or anywhere in between. We have to really take a look at it from a unified perspective. But I think what we'll see is that certain markets will take the lead on it, and then other other domains will kind of learn from that expertise. And as the technology gets better and better, it will become much easier to deploy across all different types of buildings. But at Cohesion, we are very much focused on the commercial office space to start.
Thanks, Ren. Our next question is, can you talk about the difference between indoor and outdoor air quality in typical commercial office buildings?
Yeah, so when people study outdoor air quality, they typically care about a different set of pollutants compared to indoor air quality. Outdoors, we're concerned about things like ozone and nitrogen dioxide, for example, which aren't as concerning in indoor environments. Particulate matter, which we talked about, is also part of that set of pollutants that is part of like the outdoor air quality index. So that is in common with things we measure indoors. For office buildings, the good news is that typical HVAC filter systems are really good at regulating PM indoors. But what remains, really important to keep an eye on is TVOCs and CO2 levels, which fresh outdoor air can actually help to regulate, which is what Ren talked about, and that's what we do in our optimization program.
Thanks, Tara. One more question here that I have is, what is a good baseline for air quality, and how do you know when your baseline requires action?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question because it can be kind of difficult to characterize like the baseline or what is normal, what are normal pollutant levels in a space, because they are changing all the time, which is why it's important we're monitoring all the time. So, depending on the season, depending on what occupants are doing in the building. But a lot of those fluctuations are still okay. They're not necessarily going to harm tenants. But our IAQ monitoring program is based on existing standards that are provided by organizations like WELL and Reset and ASHRAE. So based on the research and the recommendations that they put out, we aggregate that information and we have our own predetermined thresholds for each pollutant, stating, what's good, what's moderate, and what are unhealthy levels that operators should be concerned about. And we alert them to that.
Thanks. Another question, what value do you see of the UV or ionization technologies? Are they necessary beyond the dynamically optimized fresh air ventilation that you mentioned in this webinar?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So like I kind of alluded to earlier, I think the best strategy is taking into account, anything that's available that makes sense in a particular kind of use case or scenario. So I don't know if those technologies make sense for, every customer. And I do know that there's lots of studies out there that show that they do work, but also show, some of the drawbacks of those technologies and some of the trade-offs. So I know that with bipolar ionization, one of the side effects can be kind of the creation of other harmful particles, things like ozone. So, it potentially solves one problem, but creates other problems. And so it absolutely needs to be deployed with a, ventilation strategy as well, is what we would recommend. And then things like, UV cleaning technology, like UV is actually very effective at cleaning pollutants from the air. However, it's also very expensive because what happens is the UV technology, it needs a little bit of time to actually act on the air to actually purify it and clean it. And so it's very hard to deploy these things in ventilation systems where the air is moving very, very quickly. So you end up needing a lot of it. So from a cost perspective, it's maybe not the most cost efficient option. But if you have a, if this is your number one goal in your building is to improve IAQ no matter what, I know that some of our clients have really looked into kind of combining all of these technologies and saying, hey, not one of these things is going to be perfect 100% of the time, but maybe with a combination of these things, we can really kind of push the envelope and be a leader in the space and have all of these things work in conjunction to create the best indoor air quality and therefore the best experience for our tenants. So that's been kind of our learnings of these technologies. I hope that answers the question.
All right, the next question is a two-part question. How much education do property managers and tenants require to read and understand the IAQ reports that you provide them? And what are tenants or property managers supposed to do if your app flags an IAQ hazard in the building?
Yeah, sure. So I can take that one as well. So again, from a product perspective, we're trying to make something that's traditionally been invisible, visible and accessible, right? So if there are, issues with the air, we want to make sure that our product can make that as simple to understand as possible. And how so I think the first part of that question is how much education or how much, kind of training or anything like that is needed. At the end of the day, we design the product to be usable by anyone, where they open up for the first time, they can very intuitively understand what's going on and what everything means. And when something is safe and healthy, be very much assured and have peace of mind. And then when something is an issue, be able to very easily identify that issue and overcome it. So I think there's two parts there, right? There's what the experience is for someone like a tenant who's just checking, wants to make sure, wants to have that peace of mind. And then there's the experience for people who are more connected to the operations of the building. So people who are going to want to care about, things are, out of spec, and making sure that those things are being treated properly and the air is being cleaned properly. It's two different experiences, right? I think what you want to do is make sure that tenants have that peace of mind. They get the kind of the overall level of air quality inside a building, and that they're not, surprised and shocked by something that doesn't affect them. But you want to give that granular level of alerts and be able to give full visibility of all the data to the people who have the most capability to influence it. So those are the building engineers, those are the property managers. So we have a very rich dashboard for all the indoor air quality kind of stats and all that real-time data available to them. But again, our ultimate goal is to make the building intelligent enough so that it is constantly keeping those levels at a safe kind of threshold, so that it does not require kind of manual intervention or lots of attention. So the goal is, that you wouldn't really get that many alerts, if any, and you would just be checking on it occasionally to see what the kind of the mitigation process has been doing in the background. So that's what we're going for, and we see something like 99.9% of the time we keep like CO2 levels below kind of any levels that would be defined as problematic by those standards that Tara mentioned earlier, like ASHRAE and WELL and RESET. So that is something that our system can do far better than any human can. So again, to maybe summarize that very long answer, we designed the system to be very easy and very user-friendly to operate. But really, ultimately, people shouldn't have to be in the system, constantly monitoring these things, because the system should be smart enough to take care of that on its own.
Another question here. Similar to LEED, are there any accepted industry standards around IAQ?
So like we mentioned, WELL, RESET, and ASHRAE are three big ones, three big organizations that have set some standards, or at least done some research around what pollutant concentration levels are healthy within a building or unhealthy. ASHRAE has also set some standards around, minimum ventilation rates in buildings. So I think those are the three big ones. And we take that information into account when we set our own thresholds on our app as to what we're going to alert operators to.
Yeah, and I'll very quickly add on to that. I think UL is another one that has a kind of a great take on this as well. But in short, like Tara said, there are lots of people who are interested in defining what is acceptable and what is not, and helping all of the people in the space understand, how to how to really measure, if they're doing the right thing, and are they in compliance, and really giving them the ability to have benchmark to shoot for. And then also on the certification front, when they do hit those benchmarks, when they do meet those benchmarks, having some way to communicate that back out to everybody in the building to ensure them that these standards are being met and being paid attention to.
Great, thank you both. That is all of the questions that we have received. So thank you all for attending today's webinar. This is the first webinar in a series from Cohesion. So excuse me, please join us next week for our next event, Say Hello to Tenant Experience 2.0, which Cohesion's Director of Sales, Taylor Marsh, and Jake Smith from Transwestern will be discussing the future of tenant experience, including touchless tools and how PropTech enables a more productive and efficient workplace. Thank you again for joining us today, and we hope to see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.